did join a little late. This is Richard, and he's our new secretary in the committee. So please welcome him.
And we are all live.
Thank you so much, Richard. Good afternoon and welcome to this meeting of the Health and Government Operations Committee. Please bear with us. Can you mute yourself?
So please welcome him.
Thank you so much. So good afternoon and welcome to this meeting of the Health and Government Operations Committee. Please bear with us if we encounter any technological issues. This meeting is being streamed on the Maryland General Assembly Live on our YouTube channel. Committee members will be muted during the briefings. Following the presentation, please use the raise hand function if you want to ask a question. I will call on delegates to ask questions. When it's your turn, please wait a moment while staff unmutes your screen. Keep in mind that even though we're on Zoom, we will adhere to our usual committee rules of asking one brief, concise question and receiving an answer from one, not each of the panelists. And the chairman is actually in a meeting, she sends her regards, and I will be sharing the meeting today. The briefing today will be actually given by Dr. Verma. She's the president of the State Board of Dental Examiners on the board's disciplinary process and actions. And this is a report actually by chapter 361 of 2021, which is a bill that Senator Pam Vital put in. Welcome, Dr. Verma. Will you be so kind and get started?
Yes, thank you, Delegate.
Our pleasure.
I am happy to be here. Accompanying me are Dr. Leslie Grant. I apologize for the echo. Accompanying me are Dr. Leslie Grant, who is our Vice President, and our Secretary Treasurer, Dr. Robert Windsor. I will do my best to be brief, but there was a lot of information that needed to be given. Senate Bill 836 charged the Dental Board with providing a detailed report regarding its disciplinary processes. A number of questions were asked and a great deal of data was requested. The board was given a relatively short period of time to review the data and complete this report. So I'd like to take a moment to thank those board members and staff that were instrumental in preparing the report. As is the case with other state agencies, the pandemic has created a shortage of staffing at the board, coupled with the hiring freeze. It has been nearly impossible to recruit additional staff. As an example, for the 17 months prior to this, the board had a single investigator, although it had pins for 3 investigators and 1 supervisor. And it has only recently been able to recruit additional investigators. I will start by giving you a brief overview of how complaints are handled by the board. Most, but not all, of the complaints fall into 2 general categories. First, there are complaints involving infection control issues, where there is an imminent threat to patient safety. Then there are complaints that raise standard of care issues. And although these types of complaints are the most common, the board also receives complaints that raise sexual boundary issues, fraud, or scope of practice issues where an auxiliary member of the dental team exceeds their allowed scope of practice. When complaints are received by the board staff, the staff separates them on the basis of categories, as we mentioned. Those complaints alleging infection control violations, the board bases its findings on the Centers for Disease Control, Infection Prevention and Control in Dental Settings guidelines, which, as you all know, are designed to ensure patient safety and dental staff safety as well. These complaints are given priority since they may pose an imminent threat to safety. They are fast-tracked to the board's Infection Control and Biosafety Committee to determine if they warrant inspection of the practice. If so, an inspection is carried out expeditiously, and if after the inspection deficiencies are found, the case is forwarded to the full board for immediate action, which may result in a summary suspension of the dentist's license. If the board does proceed with an order for summary suspension against the licensee, that licensee is provided with an opportunity for a show cause hearing at the very next board meeting. After the show cause hearing, the board determines whether the licensee's suspension should be continued through the duration of the disciplinary process. A few of the factors that the board looks at in making this decision is whether the deficiencies have been corrected adequately and whether any remedial education has been completed. Either way, after a show cause hearing, the licensee is offered a case resolution conference, which is often better known as a CRC, to attempt to settle the matter. During the CRC, all parties may agree on the sanction and education framework for the licensee to return to practice. Most settlements recommended by the CRC panel are ratified by the full board on the same day as the case resolution conference. If no settlement is made, then the matter proceeds to a full evidentiary hearing. For cases that do not involve alleged CDC violations, those complaints are fully redacted of identifying information, including the dentist's name and address, and sent to the board's triage committee. This committee receives only the redacted complaints so that it may perform an objective assessment of whether the complaint falls under the board's jurisdiction and whether there may be a violation of the dental laws. If the triage committee does find that the complaint falls under the board's jurisdiction and alleges a potential violation of the Maryland Dentistry Act, the discipline unit begins an investigation which may include issuing subpoenas for patient records, interviewing the respondent, the complainant, the staff, or other licensees. Occasionally, other dentists with whom the complainant has sought treatment are also subpoenaed to provide their records. Once this information is gathered, the case file is forwarded to the Discipline Review Committee. This committee conducts a thorough review of the information and patient records to determine if any disciplinary action is necessary. Since 2014, the board has invited prosecutors from the Attorney General's office to be present, along with the board's own counsel, during discipline committee discussions to ensure that the board is provided with the best possible legal advice while making these potentially impactful decisions. The discipline committee has several options. For example, if there's an isolated record-keeping issue, that could result in a non-public letter of education intended to remind the licensee that the accepted standards are higher and that there is a need for improvement. However, when cases involve standards of care, it is imperative to first determine if the case is a single deviation in a particular area or if there is a broader issue. The board takes these cases very seriously and always ensures that there's an adequate investigation undertaken prior to considering any formal action. For example, if an investigation reveals that a dentist lacks sufficient knowledge to perform a procedure such as root canal therapy, lack of diagnosis of periodontal disease, crown and bridge, or over-treatment of decay, the discipline committee will request additional records to determine if the dentist may lack competency in these areas and requires remedial education. Those cases are then referred to an independent expert reviewer to ensure a non-biased analysis. The expert reviewer's report is returned to the discipline committee to determine what action is, if any, is appropriate. This is determined in discussion with the administrative prosecutors and board counsel and then sent to the full board for a vote. If the board votes to take formal disciplinary action, the case is forwarded to the Office of the Attorney General's Health Occupations and Litigation Unit for the drafting of formal charges and prosecution under the Administrative Procedure Act. Charging documents are presented to the board for review, and if accepted, the charges are served upon the licensee or his or her attorney if they are represented. A letter always accompanies the charges, which informs the licensee of a hearing date and a case resolution conference committee meeting date in which the licensee and his or her attorney may attend to attempt to resolve the matter short of a formal hearing. In the event an evidentiary hearing is conducted by the board deliberates and provides its final decision at the conclusion of that hearing. A final order is then drafted by board counsel, who is not a prosecutor, and sent to the licensee. Before a final order is issued, it may be referred to the Office of Administrative Hearings to determine if there is an antitrust review necessary. The board has no control over the length of time the OAH review may take. With regard to the summary suspension, a detailed review of the board's records indicates that the average amount of time from the receipt of a complaint to the issuance of an order of summary suspension is 53 days. This time frame includes the investigation and the inspections. The average length of time between charges and a case resolution conference is 18 days. The average length of time between a case resolution conference and the issuance of a consent order is 7 days. And the average length of time for the issuance of a final board order was 48 days. The board's assessment of our records found 6 cases over the span of 2 years that deviated from the averages. The first case was not a CDC infection control case, but rather involved a prescription drug issue. Multiple subpoenas had to be issued to gather information, and an expert consulted to assess the respondent's competency. This required 130 days until the case could be referred to the prosecutors. 4 cases resulted from delays in the receipt of inspection reports from infection control reviewers. The pandemic has had a significant impact on this, as offices had sporadic hours, the board struggled to acquire adequate personal protective equipment for reviewers, and employees transitioned to work from home. This resulted in the case referral times increasing to between 43 and 56 days. One case was delayed due to the rescheduling request made by the respondent's attorney. The board was also tasked with reviewing how its processes compared to those of other boards. The dental board's statutory discipline process is quite similar to those in Maryland and other states. This includes the filing of complaints, conducting investigations, suspending a license with adequate notice, and opportunity for a hearing, and charges which may result in revocation of a license. Other Maryland boards and those in other states may reprimand a licensee, place a licensee on probation, or suspend or revoke a license. There are also other similarities, such as the authority to discipline for failure to comply with CDC infection control and prevention guidelines, dishonesty on a board application, discipline in another state, and failure to follow acceptable standards of care. There was a notable difference with the Maryland Board of Physicians. Healthcare boards typically review with a single disciplinary committee and vote as a full board. However, the Physicians Board is divided into two panels to consider and decide disciplinary matters. A complaint is assigned to one of the two panels to oversee the investigation. If after the investigation, the panel votes to charge, the matter is referred to the Case Resolution Committee to attempt to settle the matter. If resolution does not occur, the case is referred to the Office of Administrative Hearings for a hearing and a proposed decision. This is a departure from other healthcare boards in our state. A best policies assessment was also reviewed to determine if there was a potential to decrease turnaround time. A possibility that was discussed would be to establish an additional review panel, as is the case with the Board of Physicians. The board's assessment of the bottleneck at the dental board stems from uncooperative respondents and attorneys who ignore board subpoenas and other requests for information. An additional review panel is not likely to solve this issue. The board needs an additional investigative staff, and as I said, that is starting to happen. One should also consider the complexity of cases. It would not be fair to the citizens of Maryland to rush a case through a disciplinary process without adequate investigation, simply to meet an arbitrary deadline. Another avenue considered is the use of informal processes for case resolution. A licensee is notified that charges are pending and allowed to immediately begin negotiations on requirements for an appropriate consent order for resolution of their case prior to the board actually issuing the charges. This tends to resolve the matter more expeditiously. This is very effective in cases involving infection control issues, since the violations tend to be more obvious and more easily proven. There are a number of issues that affect the board's timelines. The complexity of cases. A case that on its face alleges one violation may unveil a number of other violations over the course of the investigation. Multiple infractions that can affect patient safety can become evident as the investigation proceeds, and these need to be fully evaluated prior to any action being taken. Investigating all of these takes diligence and time. The number of dentists or support staff who must be subpoenaed and interviewed lengthens the investigation. Failure to comply with subpoenas for records or the receipt of illegible records weeks or months late, and then only when the board threatens disciplinary action for failure to cooperate with the board investigation. This has occurred frequently in large dental practices where the respondent does not have physical control of the patient records. Despite a very detailed subpoena from the board frequently receives incomplete or partial records, which necessitates additional written requests. When a licensee fails to respond to multiple requests, the board must petition the circuit court to compel cooperation. However, that is a long and inefficient process that might delay the board's investigation by months. The board is dependent on having an adequate pool of expert reviewers in order to evaluate and assist in the prosecution of standard of care cases. Expert reviewers have declined participation due to long delays in reimbursement of services. There is a severe lack of reviewers, which has caused additional delays. Staffing is a constant struggle. Many of the positions are very detail-oriented and with need for understanding of appropriate dental terminology. The board has lost a number of well-trained staff to better-paying positions over the last 5 years. Training new staffs takes a significant amount of time, and it is frustrating when this process has to restart over and over and over again with the loss of employees. I am currently serving my 7th year on the board, and there has never been a single year that since I began serving that I can recall that the board was fully staffed. The process of having staffing requests approved for HR for posting and interviewing, making an employment offer, proceeding through the hiring process is extremely lengthy. The board has lost several excellent candidates who could not wait through the approval process. This process can take as little as 4 to 6 months and as long as 12 to 18 months. Unfilled positions have resulted in pins being lost for those positions. Finally, the hiring freeze in effect for the last 18 months has hampered the acquisition of additional staff for all positions, especially in the investigative unit. The board was reduced to a single investigator who has been working to prioritize all his cases until such time as additional staff could be hired. The board is constantly reassessing our processes, and Senate Bill 836 has amplified that self-assessment. Based on these, I can report that the board has begun using pre-charge consent orders in an expanded capacity to reduce the amount of time it takes to resolve cases, expanded the tracking and accountability to ensure metrics can be followed appropriately. The board's executive director has created appropriate guidelines to ensure a more detailed ability to follow cases. We have stopped, if possible, merging cases to ensure processes move more quickly. I would like to address the Anne Arundel County case here. The board makes use of prosecutors to assist the board in decision-making on when and how to prosecute cases. We have a very good relationship with our prosecutors. In the past, it was sometimes a recommendation to combine multiple cases against a licensee for prosecution. That would result in a more efficient use of resources for both the state and the licensee. However, in this situation, combining the cases proved incorrect and resulted in delaying the prosecution against this respondent. Going forward, a thorough review will be conducted to determine if it is in the best interest of our citizens to combine cases or to prosecute cases individually. Finally, per SB 836, the board is required to make recommendations to the General Assembly. Within the report, we make several recommendations to make the Maryland Dentistry Act work better for the citizens of Maryland for the board. Specifically, the board recommends that legislation be considered making aiding and abetting the unauthorized practice of dentistry a violation. It is currently unlawful to aid and abet the unauthorized practice of dental hygiene, but not the unauthorized practice of dentistry. That is an inconsistency in the law that should be corrected. Furthermore, the Board of Physicians has the authority to compel a physical or mental assessment of its practitioners under circumstances that warrant them. This would be particularly helpful in standard of care cases, and we recommend that the dental board be granted the authority as well. The board has also contemplated non-legislative ways that the General Assembly could assist the board in its mission to protect the public. In that respect, we would ask the General Assembly's assistance in working with the administration to expedite reimbursement to allow expert reviewers and inspectors to be paid in a timely fashion. This severely affects the board's ability to retain as well as recruit additional experts. Many experts have simply quit and have refused to continue stating reimbursement issues. As a result of the pandemic, others have declined to visit dental offices until such time as the situation has markedly improved. Garnering additional PINs for staffing in our units to appropriately handle detailed investigations of cases as well as the workload. We have repeatedly requested additional investigators, an additional staff attorney, 2 paralegals, and additional clerical staff, all of which remain unfulfilled. In conclusion, the board strives for the most efficient use of its staff in completing its investigations and concluding cases, keeping in mind that there is no shortcut for proper investigation, as proper patient protection of the public is the primary consideration for all of us concerned. Thank you so much. That concludes my report, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Dr. Burma, for your presentation. We really appreciate it. Now, committee members, if you have a question, will you be so kind and raise your hand function to indicate that you have a question? When I recognize you, please wait a moment for Richard to actually recognize you. Thank you. We're going to start with Delegate Kelly, followed by Delegate Saab.
Thank you, Madam Chair, Vice Chair, Chair for the day. Thank you so much, Dr. Verna, for this comprehensive presentation and for the report. I know it was a tremendous amount of work, and I appreciate, in particular, one thing that you said in your presentation to us, which is that the process of doing this report really amplified your self-assessment at the board. And I'm wondering if you could maybe expand on that a little bit. Tell us what were your takeaways from the data pull, from looking at what the other states do differently from us. Were there any big things that you learned that you were thinking about outside of the recommendations that you gave us, the couple legislative recommendations and the expediting reimbursement? Were there any takeaways for you all? That's the first part of my question. And then the second part is, after you talk about sort of any big picture takeaways you might have for where you would like to see the board going, specifically tell us a little bit more about the process for the reimbursement for expert reviewers and the current timeline, because I think that's something we certainly would like to help with.
So Dr. Burma, I know that we have Ms. Grant and Mr. Windsor here for questions. Can you tell me who would like to answer that question?
I can take that question. I was involved primarily with assessing and assisting with this report,
you.
so I can happily take that.
Thank
One of the things that I will say that has been a little bit of a complication is the board transitioned to a new software system within the last 3 years. Part of that changed the way that the data was tracked and made it much more difficult for us to track some of the data because it didn't transition cleanly across when data was migrated. So some of it necessitated us learning that the way that we were tracking cases in compliance needed to be expanded to include the investigative unit part of it. So primarily the investigative unit was managing a particular portion of their investigative tracking, and the compliance unit, which tends to track the case in a slightly broader fashion, was tracking them, and those two were not merged. They were not tracking on the same spreadsheets, which was making for some confusion in knowing where the case was at any given time, finding out the timelines of it, and then properly following up with, for example, the prosecutors to say, hey, we've sent over this case to you. Please provide us with feedback as to what the delay is in getting us back the information from this. Because we've also had just a single investigator, it has been an issue for us to ensure that all of the data has been uploaded in a timely fashion in order to make sure that that spreadsheet is appropriate for us to track. So we've assigned additional administrative staff to that particular job to make sure that that continues to stay as updated as possible. We've also begun using the EMLO system much more broadly, which was our transition in the software. Once we've transitioned to that completely, that transition is kind of half and half. So it's kind of like when you transition to a new computer and you still have your calendar on your paper, you're kind of here and there at the same time. And so that's created a little bit of multitasking for people. And I think some of the balls have been dropped in that they're on paper, but they haven't transitioned fully to the online system. Once we've transitioned fully to the online system, we'll have amazing tracking of everything that we want to do. And that was part of our goal in transitioning to the new software, is we needed better trackability of everything, including licensing and compliance and investigation. It wasn't just one thing. We were trying to look at a broad look at that. The other thing that we have recently discovered is that the reports that were being provided to the executive director, since we did transition through several executive directors, was not occurring on the routine basis that it had been happening prior to that. So it had been happening on a quarterly basis where those reports were provided and meetings conducted in order to discuss and review where the caseload was progressing. And as the executive directors changed, that seemed to have fallen off, and that wasn't being done routinely. So that has been reinstituted in order to ensure that that is occurring. There have been a general large amount of accountability tracking measures that have been created again because of this. I cannot speak to what they were prior to my being on the board, but I do know that there was different tracking when our compliance manager was present, and that tracking hasn't been in place since we lost the compliance manager. And so the board has spent all of the time that we've reviewed all of this, reinstituting and broadening to ensure that we are tracking metrics in an appropriate fashion. The metrics that we have not in the past, for example, there's one of the timeline between providing the charges and when they actually go to an evidentiary hearing. That's not something that we were tracking in the past, but that's a metric that's been added to our compliance tracking to ensure that that's a metric we are now tracking. So in general, the metrics in general have been expanded for tracking, and we've attempted to break our cases apart into categories so that those categories of cases can be tracked separately and they can be found more easily. So if we needed to extract, for example, all the infection control cases that we've had in the last 6 months or 12 months, we could color-codedly extract those more comfortably and easily from the tracking metrics. As far as the expert reviewers, we have people still waiting for reimbursement from March. We're in November. So part of it has, the pandemic has affected everybody across the board. And we understand that at the dental board as well. We are struggling with that as ourselves. We have just recently heard that the Attorney General's office is now beginning to struggle with that significantly because they've lost a number of prosecutors. So it is our hope that whatever difficulties HR has been having with that, that they can be expedited because these expert reviewers are critical in our assessment of cases so that we can proceed with them.
And just so I understand, as a brief follow-up, if I may, Madam Chair,
Sure.
the process for getting the expert reviewers compensated goes through the HR department. Can you just explain to me who's in charge and at what point?
I think it's the Office of Budget and Management that does the actual payouts for them. The inspector submits the information to the compliance department. It goes to our fiscal manager, who then submits that report to the appropriate department for reimbursement. But that there's been a delay in that reaching them, and then the experts actually getting reimbursed.
So I know that customer service is a huge priority for the governor, and I've been speaking with the Secretary of the Department of Health about exactly these issues. So I think it would be very helpful. I hate to put more reporting on you guys, but if next time we talk about this, if you could bring sort of a spreadsheet of when payments were submitted and what the delays have been, that would be really helpful, because I do think that we're all probably on the same page of wanting to make sure to expedite that to the extent possible. Thank you so much.
Certainly, that is a metric that we are tracking. So I will be happy to find that.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. And as you all know, Delegate Kelly is our expert. She's the chair of the Health Occupations Subcommittee. So all these issues go to her committee. Delegate Saab, followed by Senator Bidel.
Thank you, Madam Chairman.
My pleasure.
And thank you, Doctor, for being here today. One of the questions that I have, I know in the report that you talk about referring cases to the Office of Administrative Hearing. Do you have a number, since you track in metrics, how many of those cases have actually been referred to the OAH?
So when our board writes a final order for any case, it is typically always referred to the Office of Administrative Hearings. That would have been 11 cases in the first year we tracked and 7 cases in the second year we tracked.
And what was the outcome for that? Do you have the data on that?
It usually returns to us. I don't have the number of how long it took to turn that around off the top of my head, but I can get that to you.
I mean, what was the outcome, what the result of the investigation? Was there any?
So when it's referred to the Office of Administrative Hearing, it's usually for antitrust review. There was no issues found, and the final board order was sent out as it was originally drafted.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Madam Chairman.
My pleasure. Senator Bidel. You're muted.
You would think we'd know by now. Thank you, Madam
It's
Chair.
okay.
Thank you for allowing me to ask a question.
My pleasure.
And Dr. Verma, thank you for your work. I know this has been a tremendous amount of work for the dental board, but I appreciate the response. I still question the fact that one case, the case that brought this to my attention, was from 2009 to 2021. And I understand that you were trying to merge cases, but this affected somewhere around 300 patients that I was able to find, as well as about 70 cases that the Attorney General's office was trying to get money refunded. And it, of course, wasn't possible for all of the various patients. So was this the only case that got involved in this attempt to merge cases that went on for years and years and years? And, you know, Dr. Woods finally voluntarily submitted his license, but do you have any other cases that went on for this period of time?
We don't have any cases that went on for this period of time, but I will create a little bit of context around that. Prior to 2014, the dental board did not have a standard of care legislation. So prior to that, it was almost impossible to prosecute anyone for standard of care issues. In 2014, when these cases began coming in, there were advisory letters written for various cases that were submitted for these. Those are non-public. So it wasn't that the dental board took no action. It was that there were multiple advisory letters. So an advisory letter is typically sent out to a licensee in lieu of prosecution to remind them that we could be prosecuting you for this, and we are reminding you, you need to make changes. There were multiple ones of those sent in. Between 2014 and the few years after that, we had a slow trickle of cases. And I believe the first 2 or 3 were combined, and then advisory letters were sent out. Following that, we had a flood of cases that came in, and it was at that point that the prosecutors recommended that we proceed with something. Unfortunately, I don't have any data as to why it took so long for this to proceed to the point, but at that point, we were getting so many cases in, and not an excuse, but so many cases being brought into the dental board, 50, 60, 70, 80 cases all at the same time against one particular licensee takes time to intake and get moving. So the only thing I can say is I agree that this was incorrect. There are not, as far as I'm aware, multiple other cases that have occurred like this. There are other cases in which cases or complaints have been combined, but those have been resolved at that point where they have gone to prosecution immediately or gone to an expert reviewer immediately. And since then, there have been no other cases that have been combined.
Thank you very much for that. And Delegate Kelly, if I can help you work through some of the issues that Dr. Verma requested, I'd be happy to work with you. Thank you.
My pleasure. Next, we have Delegate Hill.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank
My
you.
pleasure.
Thank you, Dr. Verma. It's a two-part question. Again, the case that brought this to Senator Bido's attention, there were two issues that I didn't see addressed in terms of your report on how things might be made better. One was that the licensee apparently did not report on 2 renewal applications that he or she was under investigation. And that was not captured. So whoever was doing the review did not do a check to see if the facts on the application were accurate. And the second is that you just said there was no triggering mechanism when multiple letters had been filed for this one licensee. There was nothing that triggered, wait a minute, we've sent multiple letters out, but that doesn't trigger us to look a little bit closer. So did your review come up with any solutions to those 2 problems?
Yes, one of the issues that we have with licensing is prior to us going to a fully online system, there are many times when people are filing paper applications. Those are based on people looking at them directly. However, the online system now does allow us to flag licensees when they are marking, well, there's a health and fitness section that has to be completed, and that is being scrutinized for each and every licensee. So our hope is that we are catching them. We had 2 today that we discussed at our board meeting that came through on that process. I cannot speak to us why this wasn't caught. I wasn't there at the time when this was potentially coming through, but all of the cases that have come through since then have all been flagged. The current system that we have online does not allow us to flag the license, had not allowed us to flag the licensee if something was answered incorrectly, because the system would not recognize if you answered yes or no. However, licensing guidelines have been modified in order to ensure that they are actually physically checking health and fitness on each and every application that they're getting, including renewals, to ensure that there is adequate scrutiny of all of that.
All right, thank you.
Are there any other questions? Delegate Collison.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank
My
you,
pleasure.
thank you, Dr. Verman, for your work. Would it be fair to say that in your analysis, what you've seen is there are essentially 2 major problems that are driving the issues the board is having? One is the technology and issues with technology. That seems to be the overriding issue. And the second is the reimbursement for the expert reviewers. So I'm hearing that's what you're seeing as the 2 major issues that are contributing to.
The 2 major issues that I will say that are contributing to our issues are an inadequate amount of staff, having the number of hands that we adequately need to handle the workload that is currently being presented. It's not humanly possible for one person as an investigator to handle 125 cases. That's just not humanly possible. And even if you expanded that to 3 or 5 investigators with 1 supervisor, you would still be pressed to adequately investigate all of those cases, because that's the number of cases that we're dealing with. If we're adequately looking at each and every case that's redacted that comes back for response and records, keep in mind, we get a complaint, we send out for a request or a subpoena for records. Those records have to be intaken. Those records then have to be scrutinized to see if they met all of the requirements of the subpoena. If they did not, it goes back out for the request for the remaining materials that were not provided. That has to be re-intaken. All of that takes time. Add to that the investigation time it takes for us to reach licensees, schedule, mostly virtual now because we can't do it in person, but schedule interviews with them, ensure that we schedule interviews with any staff that needs to be interviewed, schedule interviews with additional physicians or dentists that have treated the patient after the initial complaint against that respondent and interview them as well. All of that takes a lot of time, and one person cannot handle that load. We just need more hands on deck. Honestly, if you gave us more hands on deck, we could be so much more efficient and do so much of a better job.
May I follow up real quickly, Madam Chair? Just so I'm
Yes.
clear. So I'm clear. So you have about 125 cases in
Investigation at any given time.
In any given time, and you have one investigator?
We had one investigator for the past 17 months. Yes, we just recently acquired 2 additional investigators, are in, hopefully, my fingers are all crossed, in the process of acquiring 1 additional investigator. But our struggle still continues with having adequate clerical staff because all of these materials, because we're all in a Zoom format, all of these materials have to be uploaded for people to be able to review them. No one is going in person in order to review materials. And so all of that requires clerical help as well. And that seems to be an issue across the board of trying to find anyone to do that. So essentially we have investigators both doing the investigations as well as doing all of the clerical stuff that they have to do in order to do that. Whereas they should be able to hand that over to an administrative aide to handle those things, but they cannot at this point.
Do you have the pins but can't find the people, or you don't have the pins?
We have some pins and cannot find the people, but we need additional pins. We also need additional paralegal help in order to ensure that our subpoenas are not having to be drafted by the one legislative aid that we have.
Okay. Thank you, Doctor. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Any other questions before I ask some questions? Delegate Kelly.
Sorry, I know we don't usually take a second bite at the apple, but
It's
I just
okay.
wanted-
I am allowing it today because I know this is really important and it goes to your subcommittee. So go ahead.
Thank you. So I just wanted to follow up on Delegate Cullison's excellent questions because while I hear you that you want additional pins, I'm concerned because you have existing pins and you can't find the people. So I would love to get a little bit a little deeper into what's going on with the pins that you have and you can't find the people for, and where are the delays there. Tell us a little bit more about how much work is being done to find those people to fill those. It sounds like you've had some success recently on the investigator side. Can you tell us a little bit more about the staffing challenges?
Sure. So typically when we need assistance and we have filed multiple paperwork goes to HR, that is posted. That's usually a 30-day posting. Once the posting is completed, that posting results in resumes that are received by HR, which are then forwarded to us after they've been vetted through them. Once we receive those, we can begin scheduling interviews for those. Once the interviews are completed and we decide to select a candidate, that candidate then has to go through a procedural process with HR in order to be vetted appropriately and to get approval to be hired by the dental board. That process from start to finish can sometimes take as little as 4 months, but sometimes it takes as long as 18 months. And I'm not talking about just because of the pandemic, that's just been across the board. Whether that's because HR or we don't have people that respond to it as far as applications, I can certainly say that the salaries are not that attractive. And so it can be difficult to attract the best candidates for this. And unfortunately, we are asking for people to do a very detailed analysis of materials that are intaken.
I'm sorry, let me just cut you off. I totally appreciate that these are very hard jobs, and we hear this from a lot of the boards. I get that. I guess what would be helpful to us as we're trying to figure out how we can help is to really understand where this, in some instances it's taking 18 months and we don't know why and it's just lost. In other instances it's 4 months and there's a turnaround. If we want to get to a place where we're expediting that turnaround and ensuring that we're getting you the approval as quickly as we need to, we just need to know sort of how much it's happening that we're not getting candidates applying, and how much it's happened because maybe the salaries are too low, how much it's happening that they just got lost in HR for months on end. You know, a little bit more specificity would be super helpful. Not now, maybe, but next time we talk, if you can bring us those numbers,
Sure.
that would be really helpful, because I think if we have, you know, specific points that we can address and make sure that we're flagging to get things expedited. We know that the dental board has been understaffed for at least 5 years, right? So this is pre-pandemic. This is an ongoing challenge. So we need to make sure to help you as much as we can. But we also need to identify where in the pipeline the problems are. And is it different for clerical versus investigator positions?
Sure.
Thank you.
Thank you. Delegate Lewis Young.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
My pleasure.
My question relates to response 4 on page 16. It's where there are some recommendations for disciplinary processes and aligning them with other state language. And I got kind of stuck on 2 of them. One was abandoning a patient. And I thought, what does that mean? What if a dentist says, you know, I'm not sure that we have a good match here. If you're not going to follow my treatment plan, I don't know that I can really help you anymore. And the other one that raised a red flag for me was having a condition, illness, or disease that might impair ability to perform dental services. And I thought, well, there could be a fine line between impairment to perform and violation of the American with Disabilities Act. So my question is there an opportunity to tighten these up a bit, further clarify them? Because the way some of them are written now, you're potentially increasing your caseload.
Certainly, I understand that. Abandoning a patient does not fall under the we disagree on treatment options headline. Abandoning a patient would be, for example, closing your practice and leaving and not notifying anyone. That would be abandoning a patient. When a patient has requested records from an office that is slated for closure or what have you, and they have been denied access to those records, that would be considered abandonment of a patient. Or if a patient were mid-treatment and then was declined to be seen ever again by the provider, that would be considered abandoning of a patient. But disagreements on options of treatment would not fall under that headline.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Thank you.
My pleasure. Any other questions from the committee? 1 second. I don't see any, so I will then just to ask a few questions, if I may. Dr. Burma, just for clarification, how many pins do you have that you have not used?
Currently, we have at least 3 pins, I believe, investigations that we are trying to fill. We have an investigative supervisor we are trying to fill, and we have about 2 or 3 administrative pins that we are still trying to fill. We have lost 2 pins over the course of the last several years for business manager and for other administrative managers in order to, because they remained unfulfilled for a lengthy period of time.
Okay, and does the board have a subcommittee that can actually take this on regarding recruiting, right? I mean, it has to be intentional, and you must make an effort. Is there something being done proactive to change that?
We do. The executive committee is tasked with ensuring that we're following up on all of these. We have scheduled regular conversations with the HR people in order to see what we can do to expedite movement on all of these processes. We do have an executive director now who is getting more and more familiar with ensuring that these are processed appropriately. One of the downsides to having new staff when people come on is that they lack sometimes the knowledge of how to get the paperwork through appropriately. And that is also a training method. So yes, the executive committee of the board does follow up on all of these. A staffing report is provided to us at every executive committee meeting, which occurs every 2 weeks.
So this is the sort of the little issue problem that I'm having as I hear the hearing today is that, yes, you want more PIN, more staff, but you have 3 PINs that have not been fulfilled. And I feel like you need to fulfill those as well first, you know, and that it must be intentional. Perhaps HR can get a recruiter and spend a little money in finding, you know, the resources you need, which is so important. The
We
other
would love
question
that.
I have, if I may, is that I read in the report that you're working with the OAG to streamline the process where you will merge different cases against the same defendant when feasible. Can you tell the committee about how many of those are there?
No, and I believe this was a question that was asked previously as well. There are not many cases that are being merged at all. Since this case has come through, and prior to that, our process has changed in the last several years in order to ensure that we move the case through individually rather than waiting for additional cases to occur. So when the case has come out of the Discipline Review Committee and has been referred to an expert reviewer, we are no longer waiting for additional cases to catch up to go to that expert reviewer. Once they're returned to us from the expert reviewer, we are taking the case forward to prosecution if it merits it.
Okay. I don't see any other questions from the committee members, but I do want to encourage you respectfully to do the following. Will you be so kind and get in touch with Delegate Kelly and Senator Bidel and Delegate Saab, who has an interest in this issue? Will you please get together with them regarding some of the follow-up? And then also, can you get back to the committee and let us know how intentional will the HR department be to make sure that these PINs get fulfilled?
Certainly,
Okay.
I'll be happy to.
Thank you so much. And I want the committee to just take a minute before, and I want to thank you so much, Dr. Burma, for coming to the committee. We really do appreciate your testimony and we appreciate the work of the board. And please consider us a partner, okay? We're very grateful. And to Ms. Grant and Mr. Windsor, you didn't get to answer any questions, but thank you
They
for
get to
being
talk next
available. The
time.
committee appreciates you. I would like to set a deadline, if I may, when you can get back to the committee. If, you know, would 3 weeks be enough, 4 weeks? To let me know that you have scheduled meetings with Delegate Saab, Delegate Kelly, and Senator Bidel, and then also to tell me what HR is doing. May I give you 3 weeks? Do you need 4 weeks?
I would prefer 4 weeks because we're going into a holiday week and I'm going to lose a week there.
Sounds wonderful. I thank you for your flexibility. Thank you so much. And if you will be so kind and send us that to staff, that would be wonderful. I'd like the committee to take 1 second to welcome our esteemed colleague, Delegate Ann Kaiser, to the committee. And anything that she needs, I'm sure that we're all here for her. If I do not get to see you, I hope on behalf of the chairman that you have an amazing Thanksgiving. And I want to thank our wonderful committee staff members who are always there for us. Lindsay and Mr. Medina and Jen, thank you for your hard work. And Lisa, are there any questions? I saw a hand by Delegate Lewis Young. Was your hand up? You're muted. Go ahead.
No, I was just clapping when you welcomed Delegate Kaiser.
Wonderful. Thank you. Well, you have a blessed day. Thank you, everyone, for making time for us. Take good care of yourself. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
You're welcome.